The moment the transport shuttle pierced through the cloudy atmosphere of Valtros 9, a strange weight pressed down on everyone inside. It wasn't gravity, though the planet's pull was slightly stronger than Earth's, but something else entirely. A thickness in the air, as though the world itself resisted their arrival. Private Mason sat in silence, eyes narrowed at the swirling green mist beyond the glass. Around him, the elite alien soldiers of the Intergalactic Coalition fidgeted with armor clasps, calibrated visors, or chatted in low, sharp dialects he barely understood. He was the only human assigned to this mission, a last-minute substitution after the original Earth representative fell ill. No one seemed thrilled by the change. The ship jolted as it passed through the final descent layer. A deep rumble echoed through the floor. Across from Mason sat General Treknor, a massive Herlakian commander with pale violet skin stretched over rigid bone plates. He had not spoken a word to Mason since the initial briefing and showed no sign of changing that. Treknor's icy eyes briefly glanced in Mason's direction. No warmth, no curiosity, just the cold calculation of someone assessing the usefulness of a tool. Mason looked away. The landing zone appeared as a cluster of floating metal plates bolted into the swamp below. Greenish water lapped against their sides, thick with algae and decay. From above, the surface of Valtros 9 resembled a giant bowl of moldy stew. Murky brownish-green liquid, spotted with islands of fungal growth, tangled vegetation, and insect swarms that buzzed so loudly they could be heard through the shuttle's hull. The ship touched down with a metallic groan. The hatch hissed open. Immediately, the smell hit Mason. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Rotting vegetation mixed with the metallic scent of minerals, layered with the sharp sting of methane gas. Several alien soldiers coughed and covered their nostrils with adaptive filters. Mason simply pulled up the cloth scarf around his neck and stepped down onto the slick metal plate, his boots making a wet squelch against its algae-slicked surface. The mission parameters were clear. Retrieve the Blackbox from a crashed research vessel located approximately 20 kilometers southeast. The terrain would be swampy, unstable, and prone to violent weather patterns. The exercise was intended as a high-level training operation to test joint response under pressure. The human delegation had insisted on inclusion, hoping to prove that Earth's soldiers could contribute meaningfully. Mason had volunteered. No one asked why. As the team began organizing into formation, Mason kept to the rear, letting the alien specialists take charge. A scout drone buzzed into the sky, scanning the area ahead. A map shimmered into projection. 20 kilometers of tangled marshland, broken up by shallow pools, sinkholes, and rotting tree bridges. The route was planned. The first steps into the wild were taken. At first, the journey was uneventful. The ground beneath them gave slightly with each step, but their boots compensated. The air was hot and thick. Strange insects hovered near their faces, darting off when disturbed. The Herlakian troopers marched in steady formation, their posture stiff and professional. Behind them, the Altari navigators whispered in sharp clicks, adjusting coordinates and feeding updates into shared helmets. Mason observed quietly, noting how the group relied entirely on their equipment to process the world around them. About an hour into the hike, the first warning signs appeared, a faint vibration beneath their feet, the distant rumble of something unnatural. Mason paused, crouching near a patch of reeds. The vegetation moved strangely, as though the earth beneath it were shifting. He stood and glanced toward the horizon. Dark clouds rolled in faster than seemed possible, swirling with electric green flashes. The magnetic storm forecasted for the following day had arrived early. The storm hit in minutes. Their helmets glitched. The HUDs blinked, then went black. Holomaps disappeared. The scout drone plummeted from the sky like a dead bird, crashing into the mud with a burst of sparks. Treknor shouted commands in Herlakian, but most of the audio relays failed. The temperature spiked, compass readings reversed. The entire squad froze in place, caught between fear and confusion. Then came the slide. It began as a subtle shift in the landscape, a slow-motion wave. The section of land ahead, solid moments ago, slid into the bog below like melting butter. Several soldiers screamed as their footing gave way. Mason dug his heels in and managed to grip a thick tree root. Treknor fell forward but caught himself with clawed limbs. The rest scrambled to stay upright as the terrain collapsed beneath their path. When the waves settled, a wide chasm of soupy green swamp separated them from their planned route. The main path was gone. Silence reigned, broken only by the steady gurgling of the swamp and the buzzing of insects above. A few soldiers tested their equipment. Nothing worked. The atmosphere had fried everything: comms, scanners, navigation gear, propulsion units. Treknor growled in frustration and slammed his claw against the mud. One of the engineers attempted to launch a flare. It fizzled in his hand. The group was stranded, surrounded by rotting water with no clear direction forward. Mason stood still, scanning the landscape. He watched as foam formed around a floating log near the edge of the bog. It shifted, then drifted slowly westward. Nearby, a thick cluster of reeds swayed in rhythm with the current, revealing a possible flow pattern. No one else seemed to notice. The aliens were fixated on reviving their tech, as though their minds refused to process survival without it. Treknor barked a command to form a temporary base. A few shelters were erected using auto-expanding fabric, but even that glitched halfway through deployment. Mason used his knife to cut open a tangled vine and tasted the sap, bitter but non-toxic. He pocketed a sample and moved away from the group, eyes still locked on the direction the logs had taken. It was then that he began to form an idea, not a plan born of calculation, but of instinct, of memory. Something he had once read about ancient tribes building bridges with nothing but tree trunks and rope. He looked at the size of the nearby fallen trees, how their bark resisted the swamp's acidity, how they stayed afloat despite the weight, and for the first time since they landed, a flicker of calm crossed his expression. The others didn't notice. To them, he was still the outsider, the primitive human with nothing but an old backpack and cloth-wrapped boots. But inside his mind, something had already begun to shift. The storm had wiped out their technology. The swamp had devoured their path. But he had learned long ago that the earth didn't raise helpless creatures. It raised problem solvers. And Mason was already thinking about how to cross, not with machines, but with the forest itself. The camp, if it could even be called that, was an uninspired sprawl of partially collapsed shelters and damp gear strewn across the only patch of semi-solid ground available. Mason stood beneath the gnarled arch of a petrified tree, hands on his hips, watching as yet another alien technician kicked a sputtering battery pack in frustration. Green mist drifted low over the marshes like smoke, and somewhere far off, a chorus of creatures echoed haunting cries into the sky. The team was supposed to be elite, assembled from the sharpest military units across multiple species, but now the group looked more like a broken tour group abandoned by its guide. General Treknor paced in slow circles near the collapsed remains of a portable relay tower. His normally pristine armor was coated in slime and bits of vegetation, and the furrowed ridges of his skull plate twitched with visible irritation. He barked into a comm unit strapped to his arm, but the screen remained dark. An Eltari assistant, a slim, wiry male with 4 eyes and faint blue skin, held up a replacement cable and offered a hopeful gesture. Treknor squatted it away. Mason walked slowly toward the edge of the bog, eyes locked on the thick coils of vine and algae-choked water below. He squatted down and picked up a handful of the mud, rolling it between his palms. The texture was sticky, dense. It would cling to anything that touched it. His boots were still half sunk in the slop from earlier, despite repeated attempts to find higher ground. And yet, he noticed that the log he had seen before, long, dark, and bark-heavy, was still afloat some 20 meters away. It hadn't sunk. It hadn't shifted. It had simply drifted. Behind him, a flurry of cursing erupted. A Yadari field engineer, whose armor was covered in a thin membrane of crystalline scales, flung down a toolkit in disgust. He had tried to reactivate the hover units again, 6th attempt, and gotten nothing but a puff of black smoke. Sparks danced across the scorched casing, and Mason smelled burned copper waft through the air. "We have no functioning comms," the engineer growled, his voice filtered through a translator collar. "The magnetic fields have fried our long-range systems, and the atmospheric interference blocks all emergency beacon pulses. We are invisible out here." Treknor approached him. "And our hover packs? Dead." "Same reason. Magnetic disruption. Not even the backup gyros respond." Treknor narrowed his eyes. "What about surface mapping?" "Same. No. No drones, no satellites, no tracking systems. We might as well be blind. The general's jaw clenched. He turned to address the rest of the camp. We are not stranded. We are professionals. We will adapt. We will engineer a solution with what we have. Mason almost chuckled. That was the problem. What they had was nothing. Everything the aliens relied on had failed. Their pride was entangled with their technology, and now, stripped of both, they stood paralyzed. He stepped toward Treknor. "Permission to scout the area?" he asked quietly. Treknor gave him a glance filled with doubt. For what purpose? Mason gestured to the Marsh. "To find something we can actually use. Not everything here is trying to kill us. Some things might help us survive." Treknor grunted but gave a reluctant nod. Mason left without another word. He moved through the marshland carefully, stepping where he saw patches of dry root or thick moss. His boots made squelching sounds with every movement, but he stayed steady. He carried no electronics, just a knife, a thermal cloak rolled tight on his back, and a few coils of cord salvaged from a broken tent. He scanned the area as he walked, paying attention to the wind, the direction of floating leaves, the subtle tilt of half-submerged tree trunks. After 30 minutes, he found what he was looking for, a grove of tall, fibrous trees that had fallen naturally, likely during a previous storm. Their bark was thick and rubbery, resistant to moisture. He stepped onto one of the fallen trunks cautiously. It dipped but did not sink. It shifted slightly in the water but stayed afloat. Mason leaned his full weight onto it. The trunk held. He knelt down, ran his hand along the grain, and tapped it with his knuckles. The sound was dull, deep. These trees were waterlogged but still buoyant. He stood and turned, noticing several more logs wedged among the reeds, forming a natural line that stretched out into the swamp. The start of a path. A primitive, unstable one. But it was more than the aliens had managed with their fried tech. Mason returned to camp just as the light dimmed to a strange, murky twilight. Valtros 9 had a fast dusk cycle, and already the marsh lights, bioluminescent insects with glowing tails, began drifting lazily in the air. He approached one of the fireless lamps, which blinked dimly in the center of the camp, and dropped the bundle of bark samples he had collected at Treknor's feet. "These trees float," he said, "even soaked through. If we bind them together with cord or vines, we can make a floating bridge, stable enough to carry gear across small gaps, maybe even wide ones." Treknor eyed the bundle with skepticism. "This is your solution? Wood and rope?" Mason shrugged. "You have something better?" The general said nothing. Mason walked away before the man could bark a reply. With no tools, no machinery, and no certainty, Mason began testing his theory. He took 3 logs and used the spare tent cords to bind them together. The process was slow, the wood was slippery, and the cords stretched. But after an hour he had a basic prototype, a raft no wider than his own body, but stable in the water. He knelt on it and pushed off from the edge of the swamp. The platform swayed, dipped, but it stayed above water. He used a stick to push himself forward, reaching the far side of the pool in less than 2 minutes. Several aliens stood at the edge, watching with cautious curiosity. Mason dragged the raft back by rope and pointed. "We don't need hover units to cross this terrain. We just need materials and hands." Treknor crossed his arms. "Even if you are correct, it will take hours, days to build a bridge that spans the marsh." Mason nodded. "Then let's start now, before the ground under us dissolves too." A silence settled over the camp. Then, unexpectedly, the Altari assistant stepped forward and lifted a coil of vines. "These hold stronger than cord," he said, his accent sharp but clear. Another soldier, a Drolkin male with thick arms and scaled shoulders, grunted approval. "I'll chop more trunks." By nightfall, 6 more logs lay stacked at the edge of the camp. The group, once frozen in panic, had begun to move, slowly but with purpose. Treknor watched from a distance, his face unreadable, while Mason coordinated measurements and lashings with the same quiet precision that had guided him since childhood. He wasn't stronger than them, he wasn't faster, but he understood something most of them didn't. Progress didn't always mean advancement. Sometimes it meant going backward. Reaching into the past, finding old truths, and using them in new worlds. As darkness swallowed the swamp, the first raft section of the bridge floated into place. Unpolished, imperfect, but real. Mason didn't smile. He only nodded once, then went to fetch more logs. Morning on Valtros 9 came without sunlight. The swamp was blanketed in a grayish haze, thick enough to blur outlines of distant trees and smooth the edges of reality. The air felt like damp wool on Mason's skin as he stood at the water's edge, examining the progress made overnight. The floating segment of the bridge remained exactly where he had anchored it, steadfast and buoyant. A few birds, or perhaps insects with wings, chirped low rhythmic calls that echoed across the marsh. It was still early, but he could feel the weight of watchful eyes behind him. He turned around and saw the squad gathered silently behind the grove, half hidden in shadows and branches. Some had likely watched through the night, unable to sleep amidst the constant hum of alien creatures and the slow, wet slosh of the swamp moving beneath them. Treknor stood in the middle of the crowd, arms crossed, his posture rigid. His armor was cleaner now. Someone had clearly taken time to scrape the dried sludge off it, but his expression had not changed. He did not speak, he only watched. Mason stepped onto the raft with practiced ease and began pushing himself across the short channel. The logs bobbed gently under his weight, but the bindings held firm. The path he had mapped through the swamp extended further now. During the night, the Drolkin soldier, Gorik, if Mason recalled correctly, had helped him cut 3 more trunks. Each was heavier than the last, soaked through and twisted with tough outer bark, but still usable. It would take 10, maybe 12 total to span the bog's widest point, and then another dozen to build a stable walking surface. It wasn't a bridge in the traditional sense. It was a floating chain, a path stitched together with sweat and patience. He reached the other side and hopped off onto a patch of fibrous root covered in wet moss. From there he pulled the raft into place and began anchoring it with sharpened stakes carved from local branches. The sap clung to his fingers like glue. His hands were blistered, but he didn't care. The work was simple, rhythmic, and focused. He worked alone for nearly an hour, and then, without announcement, Gorik joined him, dragging 2 more logs through the mud, the cords slung over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The rhythm of the task spoke louder than words. By midday, 2 more soldiers joined, an Eltari female named Vasari and a silent Horlokian scout named Rune. Each carried either materials or makeshift tools. Mason handed out tasks like a foreman on a construction site. One person collected vines, another stripped bark, and a third cut pointed stakes. He taught them how to bind and lash, how to test the log's balance by pressing the center of gravity, and how to angle the ends slightly so the platforms connected smoothly in the water. The rest of the camp still hesitated. Treknor remained firmly rooted at the command post, issuing no formal approval but also giving no orders to stop. Mason understood what the silence meant. It wasn't acceptance, but it also wasn't rejection. It was observation. The general wanted results before he attached his name to this human plan. That suited Mason just fine. He wasn't building the bridge to prove himself. He was building it because it needed to be done. He moved back and forth along the anchored segments, adjusting, realigning, reinforcing. The bridge didn't look elegant. If anything, it resembled a crude raft tied together by jungle vines. But it worked. More importantly, it floated. When Rune stepped onto the 3rd section and didn't sink, the subtle murmurs of approval rippled through the group gathered on the edge. Mason wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked over the swamp. The other side was still far, maybe 200 meters. He'd covered 30 in a day and a half. If the weather held, he could finish in 3 more. But if another storm hit, or if the logs stopped floating, or if the swamp shifted again, it would collapse in hours. He turned back toward the grove and called out, "We'll need stronger vines. These are already fraying," Vasari replied without hesitation. "I saw some, back near the ridgeline. I'll retrieve them." "Take someone with you," Rune volunteered. Mason nodded. He didn't smile, but something softened in his expression. The others had started listening, not because he outranked them or threatened them, but because he acted. By the time dusk approached again, nearly half the squad had offered help at one point. Even those who hadn't lifted a log had begun assisting with tool-making or monitoring the vine knots for slipping. The bridge now had 6 segments, zigzagging across the marsh like a wooden spine. Mason stood on the farthest one, hands on his knees, staring into the next stretch of water. This one was wider, deeper, and filled with greenish foam that churned against jagged roots. He didn't know if the same design would work here. The current looked stronger. He'd need to add lateral stabilizers, maybe diagonal lashings across multiple logs. He crouched down and began sketching on a piece of bark using a sharpened stick. Footsteps squelched behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. General Treknor stood at the end of the segment, staring down at the half-submerged logs. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, in a quiet voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a metal pipe, he asked, "You learned this on Earth?" Mason stood, wiping his hands. "Not in person. I read it. Old tribes, river crossings. You risked the entire squad on a book?" Mason shrugged. "You risked the squad on hover units. I'd just switch plans faster." Treknor narrowed his eyes. "It is inefficient. It's survival. Nothing about it has to be efficient. It just has to work." Another long silence followed. Treknor stared out across the half-built path, then glanced behind him at the soldiers collecting vines in the dimming light. He said nothing more and turned to walk back to the camp. Mason returned to his sketch, now certain of what he needed to do for the next phase. If he angled the logs at 30 degrees and doubled the vines in the midsection, it could resist the current's drag. He'd need 6 more logs. That meant 4 more hours of chopping and hauling, maybe 5. He sat cross-legged on the platform and stared at the sky, where the stars were beginning to pierce the fog. The constellations were unfamiliar, distant, alien, but for once, he didn't feel like the outsider. Not here. Not now. The others had seen what he could do. Not in theory. In action. He thought about how easy it would have been to just wait like the rest. To sit by the shelters and wait for someone to fix a satellite or reboot a drone. But Earth didn't raise waiters. Earth raised doers. The stars reflected in the black surface of the swamp. Somewhere deep beneath him, he heard the slow movement of something massive shifting in the mud. He ignored it. He had a bridge to finish. Mason's eyes opened before the first insects began their morning buzz. A sheet of fog rolled gently over the swamp, like breath from a sleeping beast. The half-completed bridge stretched across the water behind him, its wooden joints creaking softly as the current nudged the logs. He sat up, his back sore and fingers stiff, but his mind alert. He had spent the final hours of the night refining the raft's structure with the limited materials they had left. The longer sections, the ones across the wider water gap, had been reinforced with vines crisscrossed in triangular patterns and weighed down with rocks in hollowed-out bark pockets to keep balance. Whether it would hold under weight remained uncertain. He stood and scanned the horizon. The deeper section of the swamp, a place he had begun calling the throat in his mind, lay ahead. It was darker than the other pools, with a churning slickness to the surface. Strange bubbles broke through in timed intervals, as if something beneath it exhaled every few minutes. It was here that many of the aliens had quietly said the crossing would fail. Mason disagreed. He believed it would hold, if not because of the structure, then because there was no other choice. By the time the sun's weak glow began to press through the clouds, the rest of the squad emerged from their shelters, tired but energized. Word had spread that today was the crossing. Treknor had said nothing publicly, but the way he stood near the edge of the marsh, arms folded, said enough. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was waiting. Mason gave the final checks personally. Each log segment was tightened, each vine was tested. He walked from end to end twice, pushing slightly with his foot to simulate footfalls, listening for shifts. The creaks were natural, the sway expected. He knew what failure would sound like. He'd heard it before when earlier logs had snapped from poor anchoring. This was different. This felt ready. He turned toward the crowd and pointed at the nearest soldier. "Lightest goes first," he said. "Only one at a time on each segment. Use the center rope for balance. Move slow. If you fall in, don't thrash. The vines will hold your weight." Bisari stepped forward, slinging her pack tight across her chest. Her 4 eyes blinked in sequence as she nodded once. Without hesitation, she stepped onto the first segment. It dipped slightly. The swamp let out a hungry groan. But the platform held. She moved cautiously, 1 foot at a time, gripping the hand rope Mason had fashioned from twisted plant fiber. Her movements were precise, deliberate. Mason walked alongside her on the shore, eyes fixed on the knots as she advanced. One segment, then two, then the wide central one. She paused at the midpoint, crouched slightly for balance, then straightened and moved on. Gorak waited at the far edge, arms extended. When she reached him and grabbed his hand, a cheer, not loud but unmistakable, rippled through the group. Mason didn't smile. He raised his hand and pointed to the next. Go. One by one, the soldiers began to cross. Some trembled, others hesitated at the midpoint. But the bridge held. Mason kept his eyes moving the entire time, watching for weaknesses, for knots slipping, for water rising over the logs. He adjusted the anchors twice during the first hour, and at one point climbed onto the fourth segment to realign a crooked log with his shoulder. It was physical work, sweat-heavy and exhausting, but he welcomed it. He didn't trust the bridge because he made it. He trusted it because he knew where it could break. Treknor remained behind until only 5 remained. When Mason approached and offered his hand, the general stared down at him for a moment that felt too long. Then he gripped Mason's forearm, not as a handshake but as leverage, and stepped forward. His weight shifted the bridge more than anyone else. The logs moaned. Mason moved behind him with quick, practiced steps, one arm around the rope, the other ready to brace a segment if needed. Treknor crossed in silence. When he reached the final portion and stepped off onto the far side, he turned, faced Mason and gave a nod. Not of thanks, not of submission, but of acknowledgement. Mason returned it and moved back to guide the next soldier. Hours passed. The sun never broke through the clouds completely, but by afternoon the last member of the squad had crossed. Equipment was ferried next. Packs, weapons, field kits. Mason rigged 2 larger platforms for heavier loads and used an improvised pulley system with vines to keep the path stable under their mass. The water in the throat of the swamp gurgled and hissed beneath them, but it never took the bridge. At one point, as he pulled the final cargo across, Mason noticed movement near the center log. A tendril-like plant had wrapped around the rope, twisting slowly upward. He leaned in, used his knife, and sliced it free. The plant recoiled and vanished beneath the surface. He said nothing to the others. There was no point in making them afraid now. The bridge had done its job. The swamp had lost. When everything and everyone was across, Treknor gathered the squad on firmer ground. He looked across the murky distance, then turned to Mason. His voice was even. "You knew this would work." Mason nodded. "I believed it could. Belief isn't certainty, but it was better than waiting. You defied protocol. I adapted." Treknor stepped forward, close enough that Mason could smell the earthy oil the general applied to his armor. "I don't like humans." Mason didn't flinch. "You don't have to." Treknor's mouth twitched, almost a smirk. "But I understand you now." He turned and gave a guttural command. The squad moved into formation, ready to resume the mission. The crash site was still ahead, another day's hike, but they were on solid ground now. Mason walked beside the general, silent, listening to the sounds of boots on earth, not water. Behind them, the swamp slowly swallowed the edges of the bridge. The vines unraveled, the logs drifted, the path dissolved into the murk like it had never been there. But for the squad, the memory of crossing remained, and so did the lesson. Technology failed, fear paralyzed, but one man with rope, instinct, and determination had built a way forward. The terrain beyond the swamp rose slowly into firmer land, mottled earth wrapped in coarse moss, jagged with sharp-rooted trees that stood crooked against the sky. Mason kept his pace steady near the center of the formation as the squad advanced. The soldiers had fallen back into formation, but something about the silence had changed. The quiet wasn't tense anymore. It wasn't cautious or fractured, it was collective. He could feel the rhythm in their steps. They moved like a unit now, not as individuals from different species evaluating one another, but as comrades who had crossed something that was meant to break them. Treknor walked a few paces ahead, his long strides cutting through the underbrush. He said little, but his actions were different. When the path split around a fallen tree, he didn't command someone to clear it. He ducked under the branch himself and moved forward. Mason saw Visari glance at him and then follow without hesitation. Gorak said nothing, But when a younger scout slipped in the mud, he extended his arm without being asked. Something invisible had settled into the group. Earned trust. By midday, they reached the edge of the crash site's perimeter. The wreck of the research vessel had not fared well. Half of its hull was buried under the roots of a collapsed tree cluster, while the rest jutted upward like the spine of a long-dead animal. Smoke no longer rose from the damage, but the scent of burnt alloy and plasma still lingered in the air. Bits of fabric and charred plating lay scattered like debris from a storm. Mason stepped carefully through the perimeter, his boots brushing aside soot-covered ferns. Treknor halted the squad with a sharp gesture and turned to Mason. "You've scouted terrain better than my own officers. Your eyes are grounded. Take 2 and check the remains for structural hazards." Mason didn't react outwardly, but inside he felt something subtle shift. This wasn't an order of convenience. This was an assignment born of respect. He nodded once. Rune and Vessar. The 2 followed him without hesitation. The trio moved closer to the wreck, stepping over cables and twisted beams. Part of the outer shell had split open, revealing a corridor tilted at an angle. The Blackbox beacon flashed in the shadows, still intact, though its casing looked scorched. Mason moved toward it and waved Rune back. "It's pressurized. If we pry, the gas inside might ignite." Vasari knelt beside him, inspected the seam, and removed a set of thermal shears from her belt. 2 cuts, 90 degrees apart, fast. We pull on 3. Mason braced the casing while she sliced. Sparks snapped, the metal hissed, then the seam cracked. Mason pulled, and the black box came free. He held it up toward the light and saw the green pulse of intact data storage. "That's it," he said. "We got what we came for." The walk back to the squad was quick. When Mason handed the black box to Treknor, the general looked at it, then at him. "Mission complete." Mason didn't reply. The general turned to the squad. "We move north. Extraction is at Point Axion, 8 kilometers. The terrain is dry from here." That night they made camp on higher ground. The fire pit was shallow, surrounded by a circle of stone and fed by rootwood that burned with a steady blue flame. For the first time since deployment, the squad sat together, without separation by species or rank. Gorik told a short story in his growling dialect that made 2 soldiers laugh so hard they dropped their rations. Vasari passed a cloth-wrapped root fruit to Mason and gestured for him to taste it. He bit in. It was sweet, fibrous, and tinged with something like lemon. He nodded in approval. She smiled, barely, but enough for him to see. Treknor remained quiet for most of the meal, but once the stars emerged overhead and the swamp lights in the distance began their glow, he stood and walked toward Mason. The general lowered himself to a crouch beside him, his knees crackling in the armored joints. "I read your file," Treknor said. "You weren't supposed to be here." "No," Mason replied. "I volunteered. You're not the strongest, not the fastest, but you built something the rest of us couldn't." Mason looked at the fire. "I just did what I was taught." Treknor tilted his head. "Earth teaches bridge building? Earth teaches problem solving. The hard way. You don't wait for tools. You don't wait for orders. You move. Or you die." The general was silent for a while, then finally spoke. "This is not something I will forget. Nor will the council. You'll be commended for this." "I didn't do it for that." "I know," Treknor said. "That's why it matters." The next day, the extraction shuttle arrived at dawn. It dropped through the clouds like a knife cutting water, engines quiet and polished. As the ramp descended, the squad formed 2 lines, boarding one by one. Mason stood at the edge of the grass, looking back toward the swamp. The bridge was gone now, completely swallowed. Nothing remained but a smooth patch of water and the memory of movement across it. He stepped into the shuttle last. As he passed Treknor, the general extended a closed fist in the human tradition. Mason bumped it with his own. No ceremony, no rank, just a gesture of mutual understanding. As the shuttle lifted, Mason watched the world shrink beneath him. He didn't know if he'd ever return to Valtros 9, or if the others would ever speak of the bridge again in official records. It didn't matter. What mattered was that when everything collapsed, equipment, command, structure, he built something, and not just from logs or vines, but from trust, from instinct, from action. The sky swallowed the world, and the stars came again. But this time, Mason knew exactly where he stood among them.